Well, I'm going to get us started. Good evening. My name is Maribel Blanco. I am Executive Associate Dean here at the Fletcher School. Welcome everyone to the third in our series of panels about Afghanistan. As a School of International Affairs, these events are designed to supplement our students' classroom learning experience and to fortify our community's understanding of the current global landscape. We aim to provide a wide range of viewpoints from both practitioners and scholars, from the American viewpoint, and from those of others. The first panel featured our own Fletcher faculty in discussion. The second panel featured Fletcher faculty in discussion with regional scholars, discussing the implications of the Afghanistan situation on the surrounding area. Tonight, we are so pleased to be able to present a conversation with three members of the Fletcher family, each with their own distinct experiences on the ground in Afghanistan. We are lucky to welcome Sarah Shays, who has graciously agreed to serve as tonight's moderator. Sarah is an award-winning former journalist who lived in Afghanistan for a decade, including serving as a special advisor to the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, Admiral Mike Mullen. She is the author of, most recently, of On Corruption in America and What is at Stake. She is also the daughter of our own beloved Professor Antonia Shays. Sarah is joined tonight by two of our alumni, Eliot Ackermann and Rasima Alam, who she will introduce shortly. Tonight's panel will begin with a discussion led by Sarah and will conclude with a Q&A with questions to be moderated by Neha Ansari, a PhD candidate here at Fletcher. You are welcome to submit questions in the chat, and we ask that alumni identify themselves as such when submitting a question. And with that, I'm delighted to turn things over to Sarah.
Thank you very much indeed, Maribel. I just want to make sure, yes, all systems are in order. Thanks so much. And thanks for hosting these conversations on, a topic that I think will occupy us for a while. We have with us Rasima Alam. She's a Fletcher grad, of course, 2007, and a retired Canadian diplomat with extensive experience in both development and diplomacy, having worked for the UN and the Gates Foundation, as well as the Canadian government. Her career has taken her to Timor-Leste, Thailand, Malaysia, and Pakistan, as well as Afghanistan, where she handled humanitarian assistance at the Canadian Embassy in Kabul in 2010 and 2011. Among other awards across her career, she received the Governor General of Canada's Operational Service Medal for that deployment. Now, she seems to be doing intra-Canadian diplomacy on behalf of her country's financial regulator. And then, during 5 deployments to Afghanistan and Iraq, Eliot Ackermann, Fletcher 2003, was awarded a Silver and a Bronze Star for Valor, as well as a Purple Heart. As a writer, he's just as highly acclaimed, his work having been shortlisted for the National Book Award and nominated for several other prestigious prizes. Here's what the New York Times had to say about his Dark at the Crossing. The most vital literary terrain in America's overseas wars is occupied not by journalists, but by novelists. And Eliot Ackermann is one of them. But guess what? Eliot's also a journalist. So go find his gripping and insightful work at Time Magazine, Esquire, The New Yorker, The Atlantic, and elsewhere. Thanks to both of you for joining us tonight. And I'm just going to ask a couple of questions of each of you. And I would love you to join, jump in if you want to ask a follow-up to each other. Like, let's try to make this as kind of informal and dynamic as we can. But I'd like to start with you, Rasima, to ask you, I mean, one of the things that's troubled me, and I think really falls in the purview, the broader purview of the Fletcher School, has to do with the role of allies in a complex multinational effort like this one. And I mean, what occurred to me, or what finally got through to me as I was living in Kandahar and trying to prevail on Canadian officials to do, various things that I thought it would be important for them to do, since Canada kind of had oversight over Kandahar province. What I realized was you guys didn't have freedom of motion entirely. You were, to a significant effect, I think, subservient to the United States. Could you talk to me about that, and the degree to which, tell us about that, and the degree to which that relationship constrained your country's ability to pursue its own policy?
Yeah, that's a really good point. And it's very interesting because in Canada, the way that Camp Nathan Smith, which was the base in Kandahar, which was operated and managed by the Canadians, you're right, it did have some constraints. But at the same time, I feel that they did have their own objectives, and they looked to achieve those, but they were in constant coordination and collaboration with the Americans.
I guess what I have, whoa, something's feeding back. Is that better? Okay.
Yeah.
I guess what I had in mind was not so much the detailed elements of, let's say, development policy, but maybe some of the more overarching political issues. For example, President Karzai's younger half-brother was kind of the king of the South.
Karzai.
Yeah,
yes.
exactly.
Yes.
And I mean, were you aware of whether Canada really had a free hand to deal with him?
That's a really good question. So now I wanted to preface this conversation that, I wanted to provide the Canadian or the ally perspective and the development perspective, but because our ministry at that time, sorry, not our ministry, but our embassy was integrated. So we had reporting and we had information, and from what I understood, they were interacting, but I don't know to the degree. But at the same time, like the governor of Kandahar, that was someone that was in regular contact, and they were really, they did have freedom of motion with him, actually, to, guide, advise, etc., and really coordinate and collaborate on what was happening in the security situation in Kandahar.
Interestingly, the Karzais cleverly appointed a Canadian citizen to be governor. It was before your time, but I was like, wow, this again is how diplomacy can take place in actions rather than words. And
exactly. And I think that was actually a benefit, because I think there was like a foundation that was there that they could build upon instead of having to build one incrementally.
So the way a lot of Kandahari saw it was, the Canadians are going to let him do whatever he wants because he's a Canadian citizen. So let me ask.
It's interesting, and I'll just say one more thing, because many Canadians who are Afghan heritage, they actually went back. We had many Canadians in the Ministry of Finance. We had many Canadians who felt compelled to go back, and they did, and they held high office and were supported by the Canadian government. And I actually think, because I think it was a good way, because this was the first this level of international commitment by Canada since Korea. So they also needed to take those baby steps into getting into this foray of their commitment, and it was really a commitment of the 3D model, which we used to have, which was defense, diplomacy, and development. So that's the model that they adopted, and this made it easier to implement by having known civil society, known actors, and known people in Kandahar province. But to have those allies, in fact, already there.
I want to come back to this was the biggest deployment since Korea, but let me just ask you quickly. You also, I think, have been recently involved in dealing with the repercussions of this whole. Could you just briefly describe, how a diplomat who was there a decade ago suddenly finds herself or a former diplomat thrust back into the story?
Well, and I'll say two things. I want to, because there's two parts to that story. And just, during like 2012, 2013, there was economic pressure in Canada, and the government really wanted to pare down the government. So my ministry, the Canadian International Development Agency, was merged into the Foreign Ministry. In effect, a lot of people left the service, they left somehow. So this was a posting that, I was like, okay, this was my, cutting of the cord, as they say. I didn't look back, because I was like, okay, my job doesn't exist. The ministry that I was attached with doesn't exist anymore. So that's the end of that chapter. And it was a really meaningful 2 years, right? It was the high point of my career. It was the most responsible. It was the highest level that I had achieved in the Canadian government as well. But it's a posting that has lived with me since then. And I know now it's going to live forever with me, given this new situation and the new reality that we find ourselves in. And all of August, because you can find people on LinkedIn, on Facebook, etc. I had many former staff of our embassy, many former, actually current staff of some of my programs that I had with the UN programs reach out to me in cries and desperation for help to leave the country, because one person sent me a letter or an email of a death threat that they had received. And so, and I think Canadians in general, and especially Canadian public servants, we're very dedicated. And even in our off time, we're always doing something. So of course, I was going to respond any way I could. I wrote to all my partners. I wrote to my former colleagues and staff who are still in Ottawa, to ask, what I can do and how can I help this person, because I'm not in the government anymore. I'm not in the federal government anymore anyway. And so they provided me with a lot of help and support and solutions so that we could get Canadian former colleagues out of Kabul. The other challenge that I also had was some people who they were Canadian partners. So there were programs that were Canadian funded, but they didn't work in the embassy. So they didn't have those rights and that infrastructure. So I had to suddenly become an advocate for them, because they were not eligible in that first wave in August. The criteria was very fixed. It was for former staff. And then I became an advocate. And so I wrote back to because we have a group chat, of course, of my former colleagues. And I asked them, what should I do? How can I advocate for some of the things that you want? Because I'm not in government anymore, so I can say what I want. So what are the things that you want?
That's interesting.
That you can't say?
Yep.
So what happened was I ended up writing a letter to the Minister of Immigration, and during an election, advocating for the staff of former program partners to come to Canada. And I asked for the stipulation of the UNHCR, the bar for refugees to be to be removed, because everyone knows the situation. We don't need people to reach that bar. Remove it so that people can come and leave quickly. I also reached out to many former Fletcher alumni who were working in Kabul, who were at the State Department, saying, help, what do I do? Because my government won't take these staff, can you help?
Right.
And of course, they said, Rasima, jump on Signal, we'll have a private chat, here's the information, here, do this, do that, and away we went. Yeah. So I think that's how this is my second part of my employment. Yeah. That's what happened. And I think that this is going to continually, it'll be continual effort.
Yeah. Thank you. Eliot, I feel like you have spent a lot of your writing career kind of exploring these repercussions, these repercussions for service members, for Afghans, and on the Syrian border. A lot of different perspectives on the repercussions of these wars. Would you expand on what you've been taking in and the insights that you've been gaining?
Sure. I think when we look at the end game in Afghanistan, I think sort of the bumper sticker, at least that the administration was selling with this withdrawal strategy, was that it's time to end forever wars. And I think it's very easy to ostensibly get people on board for, yes, no one likes forever war. We want to end these forever wars, but it kind of begs the question of, what does it mean to be at war? And I think that's sort of a very, Fletcher-esque question, probably takes many of us back to, 7:30 in the morning at Dick Schultz's class, if you've had that experience. So I've done a lot of thinking about that. What is it? I think we know what it means to start a war. Usually that's a little bit more clear than what it means to end a war. And that sort of goes to the question you just asked for Seema. She's talking about being sucked back into this, and that tracks with my experience in August and those of, many of my colleagues who are either journalists or veterans. And so I would offer up one observation, which actually takes me back to high school. When I was a high school student, we studied the Iliad. That's the first time I read the Iliad with any type of real application. And the copy of the Iliad that I was given, the translation, on the cover, there was a photograph, and it was a photograph of Omaha Beach and the landings there, and it just had one word on the cover. It said Eliot. And that edition of the Eliot has always stuck with me, because in many respects, our American story of what it means to go to war and be at war is in fact the Second World War. And it's a war where there's a beginning, there's a middle, there's an end, and typically we like to be the good guys. But that's the wrong story, and it's been the wrong story of American war making for quite some time. And somewhere there's an additional ingredient that's sort of been added into the mix, and it's this idea that the war only ends when all of the troops come home. Well, that's only proven true in the wars that the United States has unequivocally lost. So
right.
Yes, all the troops came home at the end of Vietnam, and we unequivocally lost in Vietnam. All of the troops have now come home at the end of the Afghan war, and it is a war that we have unequivocally lost. I'm also an Iraq war veteran, and the troops have not actually all come home from Iraq. We still have a not insignificant number of U.S. troops in Iraq in the thousands. And there's this sort of intense irony, I think, that when we look at the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, I certainly would not go so far as to say that we won the Iraq war, but I wouldn't actually go so far as to say that the United States unequivocally lost, in so much as there is an Iraqi government there. They've gone through, I think now, four successive parliamentary elections that have been, relatively peaceful. They, of course, have their own dysfunctional elements, but guess what? So do we right now. So I think that, that in some respects adds a wrinkle into how we conceptualize these forever wars. And I would just add one final observation, which is, I was having a conversation with an old friend of mine who our time in the military tracked very similarly. We both are Iraq war veterans and fought in some of the same places there. We're both Afghan war veterans who work in special operations. And as we watched Kabul fall, the two of us, and we're both out of the military now, but we were both observed that, we had also seen places in Iraq like Fallujah and Ramadi fall a few years before, and that our emotional response to watching Kabul fall and Afghanistan fall was far more intense.
Interesting.
And we were trying to understand, why is that? Why? And frankly, he fought in Fallujah and Ramadi. I fought in Fallujah. And from very intense combat. So why was it that seeing the Islamic State go through those cities didn't strike us in the way that watching Kabul fall did? And when we sort of analyzed our response, I think the conclusion we landed on was that if you look at the history of the United States has only fought two wars that were predicated on an attack on the homeland. the first obviously is the Second World War with the attack against Pearl Harbor. And that again ended with an unequivocal and unconditional US victory. The second, obviously, is the war in Afghanistan. Now we can talk, and I'm sure we will, about the many ways the mission veered and strayed, but the inception of the Iraq War or the September 11th attacks, that is an attack on the homeland. And that war was ending in an unconditional US defeat. And I think that, I'll only speak for myself, was a very, very bitter pill to swallow.
Yeah. Eliot, I totally agree with what you're saying. Watching Kabul fall, I was so heartbroken and sad because I've walked the streets of Chicken Street. I've, there's like many places that, I remember, and many, Afghans that I would see on a regular basis who knew who I was. And watching it was just so heartbreaking because he'd spent so much time, building relationships. And, like one of the things that I always say about Canada is, and Canadians, especially like when we're in like an American context, we're the softener. We like people come to us with problems that they can't solve in an American context. And I'll give you an example. One of the things that the president wanted to do, he wanted to close all the women's shelters. I don't know if you remember this, but he wanted to close all the women's shelters in Afghanistan because he believed there was no domestic abuse. And so people came to the doorsteps of the Canadian government in the embassy. They're like, can you guys help us talk to the administration, the Afghan administration, to solve this problem? Because they wanted to close the Ministry of Women's Affairs. They wanted to close, all its infrastructure. But was something that, landed on at the feet of Canadians.
Canadians.
And so things like that, Eliot, like I agree, because there's those like milestones and achievements where, we did have successes, and to see Kabul fall and to see the heartbreak of not only us, but Afghans, because we were there the whole time.
I would just, Sarah, if you allow me, I just would want to add one thing to Rasima's point, which is an observation. It's actually made to me by another colleague of mine I worked in intelligence with, and he and I were trying to, and have been trying to get folks out, like many people like Rasima and others have. And he made the observation, he said, one of the things that's so poignant to him, and frankly was poignant to me too, he said, when we waged this war, because of its duration, it was oftentimes waged in a very personal way. And what he meant specifically was, in our field in special operations and intelligence, that, we had our target list, the people we were going after, our adversaries, like we knew exactly who they were. We had their photographs, we tracked their movements, we were in these elaborate games of cat and mouse with them. And oftentimes we would hear that they had come to learn who we were. As US service members and special operations and intelligence officers would cycle in year after year to Afghanistan. And as the war was being waged in this very personal way, it was also for so long being waged, it's a forgotten war. A number that I keep coming back to is, Rasmussen in 2018, really before people were paying attention to Afghanistan again. In 2018, the lead up to the midterm elections, put a poll in the field basically asking Americans, what are the issues you care about? And one of the questions they had was about Afghanistan. And one of the interesting findings of that poll was, when asked, 42% of Americans couldn't even say if the war in Afghanistan was going on anymore. Right. Not that they supported or didn't support, like they just didn't even know if it was still happening. So this sense of having waged this very sort of intimate war, and it's also a forgotten war, I think made this collapse when it occurred, again, very personal, in that suddenly everyone is on the phone with each other. I mean, I'm in signal groups with people from interpreters I worked with and corporals I worked with in the Marines to 4-star flag rank officers. And we're all just trying to get our little group of contacts out. And I think seeing that type of collapse and seeing the end be so personal as well was something I'll carry with me for the rest of my days.
Yes, I totally
Yeah,
agree.
it's I mean, what you said before, Eliot, made me think of two things. One is a comment that a friend of mine who was also deployed made, which was, again, as you say, this narrative of ending the forever wars. And she just raised the issue, is it possible that the way one ends a war is as imperialistic? In other words, by just ignoring the impact on 40 million people, can that be just as imperialistic as the way you started it? Like once you started it, it exists. And so you can't just pretend it didn't.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's, and there's also the idea of can ending, I mean, I believe this, that ending the war in this way, whatever that means, whatever this policy decision is a far less humane decision than perpetuating the war. Again, whatever that means. I mean, there are currently about 2,500 troops in Iraq. And if you look at the casualty levels those troops have taken, and there's about 1,000 in Syria, comparable to what US troops were taking in Afghanistan, we're talking relatively the same amount of numbers. So how does it in the near term, the last like 3 to 4 years? So how, it seems to me it's very dissonant to see the president go in front of the United Nations, and I'm not saying this in a partisan way, but say for the first time in 20 years, the US is in a war. Well, hold on a second, because I don't believe that us just yanking these 2,500 troops out of Afghanistan means that we're suddenly not at war. And again, it begs these much larger questions of, what does it mean to be at war? And I think with regards to Afghanistan, this idea that the conflict in Afghanistan has been static in some way. The years that I was there, 2009, 10, 11, around that time frame, there were up to 150,000 US troops fighting and surging in Afghanistan. Before Trump really begins these negotiations, we'd drawn down to around 15,000, and then we continue to draw down those last numbers. So the idea that this is static, to me, it has led to what I would argue are some potentially ill-informed policy decisions and setting conditions where we very well might do it. We might wind up doing what we have had to do in Iraq, which is to recommit troops. So we'll see. But the United States might be done with Afghanistan, but I certainly do not believe that Afghanistan is done with the United States.
There's one issue that I think has not gotten sufficient attention yet. I mean, in the public debate in the United States, I go back to, Senate and House hearings, which were kind of laser focused on the tactics of the military tactics of the withdrawal itself. And what I was surprised is how little attention has been given to the process and the terms of the Doha Agreement, to which the United States felt itself to be so rigidly bound. Do you have any thoughts about that, Eliot?
Well, I certainly think that it was a bad deal. It was a bad deal from the outset, in so much as we began negotiating unilaterally with the Taliban, which was a critical mistake. It also echoes mistakes we made in the Vietnam War, which led to the collapse of the government in Saigon. But so we began basically unilaterally negotiating with the Taliban. One of the things we concede to the Taliban is that we're going to release these 5,000 prisoners out of Bagram. That has to happen, and it has to happen before we even bring the Afghan government into the negotiation. So it's the whole thing. The whole deal is a mess. Now, I think that when the Biden administration comes into power, there is what I feel to be a rather disingenuous posture, which is, well, the Trump administration has made this deal and there's absolutely nothing we can do. We own it. I mean, listen, when the Biden administration signed dozens of executive orders in the first 24 hours of taking power that rescinded Trump's executive orders, pulled us back into accords like the Paris Climate Accord that the Trump administration had pulled us out of. They clearly had the latitude to renegotiate this deal if they wanted to. So my belief is, at this point, if they're going to keep up with the deal, they own that deal as much as the Trump administration owns that deal. I think so. I totally agree with you, Sarah, that like, yes, we should be looking at the policy decisions and the sets of calculations that led to not only Doha, but continuing that agreement into the Biden administration and trying to execute this troop withdrawal. I would just add, I think the logic of the Biden, and I don't agree with the Biden administration's policies and haven't in all of this, but I've always felt like I understood the game they were trying to play, and it's not an unreasonable one. And I believe that they were looking at the situation when they took power, and they had a few assumptions. The first was that, America doesn't care about Afghanistan, which I think if you're sitting here in February or March of 2020, right before he announced the withdrawal, and you're looking at those poll numbers, like the one I mentioned from Rasmussen, like, yes, America doesn't care about Afghanistan. So they don't care about Afghanistan. We can withdraw all of our troops in September. That will be popular. And this is the biggest assumption. And there will be a decent interval. There's going to be a decent interval. And if you look, Saigon, we pull out in 72, the government falls in 75. Soviets leave Afghanistan in 89. I mean, Najibullah is hung in 1994. I mean, we're going to have a decent interval. Maybe it's 6 months, maybe it's 2 years, it could be 3 years. And in that decent interval, we'll be able to make a credible case that we're not the ones who caused this collapse. And the critical flaw in their strategy, obviously, is there was no decent interval.
Yeah.
And the second they didn't get their decent interval, the writing was on the wall that it would be a failed policy.
I have several questions I'd love to get into with both of you, but I just feel as though maybe we should widen the conversation a bit right now, and I might jump back in because there are directions I could take that, and there's directions, as I said, Rasima, about Canada's biggest deployment and whether this was a pretext for Canada to militarize itself. But Neha, are you starting to see some questions lining up?
Yes, I am.
So why don't we go to some of those questions, and then I might grab the floor back again.
Sure. We can start with the first question is by Lark Escobar. He is a current Fletcher student who is working actively to evacuate hundreds of Afghan refugees, Afghan citizens as we speak. And so he's asking that I'm frustrated by the lack of formal plans of all the coalition forces and NATO governments to evacuate Afghan allies who are endangered. Do you anticipate any formal evacuation plans in the coming months?
I can't speak to that directly. I would like to just say I have a lot of friends, within non-US NATO leadership, or were in Afghanistan. And the fact is that NATO allies were not really consulted about this. They were informed. That's at least the experience of European allies, that there was supposed to be a NATO foreign and defense ministers meeting on whatever it was, I think April 14th of 2021. And the Washington Post announces on the 13th that Biden has decided to pull all troops out by thus and such a date. And so really the allies were, I feel like, second-class citizened. And that's part of why I asked the first question that I did of Rasima. Is that your understanding, Rasima?
It's a really good point, and because I'm not in the government anymore, so I really don't know. But I mean, my personal opinion and my opinion based on the historical, like what I've seen, I think for Canada, and I just want to point this out too. Canada actually, its military operation ended on March 31st, 2011. So it was one of the first allies to leave. So this is not Canada's first time leaving Afghanistan in a sense. Its development and political program still existed, but we did leave. We withdrew and transformed our program from a military one to a civilian one in 2011. And for an evacuation, based on my experience, I mean, and remember, there's one main airport in Afghanistan. Kabul Airport is the biggest. where it has, the most international flights. But for, a country like Canada to go back in, we would need partners. There would be like a huge effort required, and it wouldn't be a sole effort. It would be a collective one. Canada really does operate multilaterally. So it would be with the partnership with other countries, not just of its own willing and resources.
Eliot, do you
imagine?
imagine?
No, I know that there are talks going on. There are talks going on in Doha right now about obviously the food aid that needs to get into Afghanistan, and what type of recognition, if any, which seems doubtful, the United States would offer the Taliban government. But clearly, one of the points of leverage that the Taliban hold in those negotiations and that they've used over the past month is who gets out. Who's getting out on these flights. The Qataris have helped. So it would not surprise me if you saw, if not something that is overtly a formalization of people who can get out, but is sort of at least what I've observed, the continued sort of drip, drip, drip of flights leaving Afghanistan that are filled with refugees, and a more formalized and kind of a less off the cuff set of criteria for who is going to be allowed to leave and who will have to stay.
Yeah.
Incidentally, Pakistan, the Pakistani government has agreed with the Afghan government that, or with the Taliban, that Afghans cannot transit through Pakistan. That means Afghans who even have a passport, a Pakistani visa, and a gate pass will still not be allowed to transit through Pakistan unless they also have the written permission, a permit issued by the Afghan Ministry of Interior, which is run by Sirajuddin Haqqani, who's a international narcotics trafficker and terrorist. So the Pakistani government is definitely helping the Taliban increase the leverage that Eliot's talking about. What were you going to say, Rasima?
Yeah, no, I just was going to say that, that it's going to be exceptionally difficult to leave. From before, it's just going to be very difficult to leave, and I think it would be a Herculean effort to do that, and to rely on some of the regional partners would also be very difficult too.
Well, particularly regional partners that are the masterminds of the Taliban. Neha?
Thank you. Yeah, the next question. First, I would like to make a correction. I mistakenly attributed the wrong gender to Lark. She's a woman, so just wanted to put that out there. Sorry about that. Next, we can go to Ken's question. I think he's a current student. He hasn't said so, but he's basically asking, if the war was not ended simply because we withdrew our troops, what are you recommending or predicting? He is asking whether we should have established a DMZ-like outcome in concert with our allies. How long are you suggesting that we should have remained? I think this is these questions are follow Eliot's comments.
Sure. So if I was president of the United States, the way I would handle Afghanistan, and you can feel free on this Zoom to swiftly impeach me for my views, but listen, I think circa 2017, if the president of the United States, whoever that person was, would have given a speech to the American people and basically said, here are the current troop levels in Afghanistan, here's the trend line with our ability to stand up the Afghan forces. They are currently taking the fight to the Taliban. We are committed to this effort for all of the following reasons, from September 11th to the key role that Afghanistan has played in the region and the world. We're not going anywhere. America, this is why. I think you could have potentially seen a different outcome in Afghanistan. So let me roll that back for a second. I think when you look at the Afghan war, I mean, there were critical mistakes that have been made since 2001. I think the mission creep we saw in Afghanistan under the Bush presidency, and as well as our inability to keep our eye on the ball and our invasion of Iraq in 2003 was a fatal strategic mistake. To go forward, I would say when we surged troops in 2009 and when in December of that year, President Obama gave a speech at West Point in which not only in the same speech, but in literally the same sentence of that speech, he announces both a surge to Afghanistan and also the date that all those troops are going to come back was a fatal flaw of our strategy there. And then going forward to the Trump administration, I think this bad deal that was negotiated was also a fatal for us. So, I'm sure many people on this call have heard this saying, but when I served in Afghanistan, one of the truisms of the war was it was said that the Americans have the watches, but the Taliban have the time. And at no point in 20 years of war was the United States or the Afghan government able to convince the Taliban that we had both the watches and the time. Had we been able to convince of that, I think that was probably our best outcome, not only to getting to a more, a better solution in Afghanistan, but actually doing it much, much more quickly. So there have been arguments sort of made that, listen, if you look at, and this is sort of my comments before, if you look at the presence of US troops around the world, at the end of the Second World War, 30,000 troops stay in Western Europe. We still have troops in the Korean Peninsula. And yes, that's all well and good, and I think true, but there's also examples like, for instance, in Colombia. I mean, in Colombia, a war fought in our own hemisphere, that has been a 30+ year narco war, just like Afghanistan, which has actually led to a somewhat reasonable result. So I am not a warmonger, but I actually think that the course that we are going down is one that is going to perpetuate conflict in Afghanistan. And again, as I said, we might be done with Afghanistan at this moment, but Afghanistan is not through with us. And I think if insanity is doing the same thing twice and expecting a different result, that is currently the US policy in Afghanistan.
I would like to agree, but add, I think there are some very serious non-military mistakes that were made, and they include ignoring the role of the Pakistani military, not just in allowing the Taliban to hang out, in Pakistan, but in fact, concocting and then reconstituting, arming, equipping, training, and I suspect commanding and controlling the Taliban. I don't know how you get as sophisticated and geographically astute campaign as the one we saw, take place this year without some kind of central command and control. Not to mention harboring Osama bin Laden. If you go back to the, authorization for the use of military force, objectively, the United States could legally wage war on Pakistan, it having harbored Osama bin Laden twice. And I would also say our refusal to address the fact that the Afghan government was treating its own population like booty. I mean, it was wholesale looting, and it wasn't just money, it was humiliation. And when you get shaken down nastily by your government officials who are supposed to be there to serve and protect you, and your police and army soldiers, at some point, your indignation explodes. And at least where I lived in Kandahar, you had to work pretty hard not to join the Taliban. And so you give someone enough good reasons to join the Taliban, they will. Mm-hmm. And that was a point that was made constantly starting about 2008, not just by me. And just the refusal, I think, of our civilian leadership, not just on how many troops we deploy or for how long, that's what they kept, I want to say, obsessing about. All the civilian leaders were all talking military strategy and tactics. That's not really their job. Their job is deal with Pakistan. That's a diplomatic issue. Deal with corruption in the Afghan government. Stop feeding it. So, and I'm sure we could all talk a lot about that. But Rasima, you told us that Canada pulled out much earlier in 2011 yes. in terms yes. of the military yes. side of the operation. So what was the thinking that, went into that, and what is the, I want to say, kind of assessment of the rightness or wrongness of that decision?
It's so interesting because, preparing for this talk, I went back to like some of my notes, and I was, trying to remember, when I first, left Canada to go to Afghanistan, one of the guiding principles or the guiding report that we had was the John Manley report. So there was a report that was written in 2008 by the Deputy Prime Minister at the time, in 2008, but in the previous government, he was the Deputy Prime Minister. And he wrote this report, and actually I was just reading it this afternoon, and it's literally the second last line of the report. It says that, we have to be committed. This is, the Afghans want us to stay. They need us to stay. And, this was a commitment that they wanted to make, given Article 5 of NATO, that they were, strong partners of the US, but they also wanted to uphold human rights and human security, which, Canada very much believes in. But the last line of that report says, we should not leave prematurely. And I have been that line has been going over and over in my head today, because thinking that, and it's really interesting to me too, because, in 2011, the war in Afghanistan was for many, many years and many months, front page news in Canada. After the war ended, there was an election called in May of 2011 where the Prime Minister, Stephen Harper, he actually won his majority. It was the third time that he was elected, and he finally got his majority. So a lot of Canadians believed it was the right decision. And then, because we had 169 soldiers that were killed, we had two diplomats killed, one diplomat seriously injured in a IED attack in 2009, and she was the sole survivor of that attack on December 29th, which, and that memory and that, she walks the halls in Ottawa, and that it's a living reminder, of Canada's engagement in Afghanistan. So it's just, I think that, Canada really wanted to achieve objectives, and exactly as Eliot pointed out, they didn't have the time. They didn't want to be committed long term. They wanted to establish their intervention, but what they really wanted to do was to have their military intervention end and transfer their resources, their advising to the Afghan civilian population and the Afghan government, so there would be a seamless transition, and then Canada could exit.
Yeah.
If I could just make one very quick point. A book I would commend anyone listening, if you haven't read it, and I'm sure it's on many Fletcher reading lists, is A Bright Shining Lie by David Halberstam.
Fantastic.
And which is about essentially John Paul Vann, who was an Army officer and then later a State Department development officer. And he famously said, and he basically served in Vietnam for pretty much the duration of the war. And he famously said the problem with Vietnam wasn't that we fought a 7-year war, it was that we fought 7 one-year wars. And so It's very easy to look back in Afghanistan and say, well, we fought there for 20 years. What do you expect? Yes, that's a long time to be a war. But I would offer that really for at least half of that war, if not more, at any given point, we being America and the Allies, we're 12 to 18 months from a drawdown, from withdrawal. And so we talk about Sarah's point, and I absolutely agree with what you said about Pakistan, and as well as corruption and the looting of the Afghan people. But I think we also need to look at what was our role in creating the conditions for that corruption.
Absolutely.
And so much as if you're working in the Afghan government and you know that you at any point are 12 to 18 months from a drawdown, and you can feel in your bones correctly that this drawdown could potentially lead to a situation like what we just saw, you're probably siphoning money off to create your contingency plan, which is to get you and your family out when that day happens. And so I think our posture in Afghanistan, doesn't excuse every last bit of corruption, but it certainly contributes to it.
I would say sorry, Sarah. I just want to say one thing about that. And this goes back to, Canadians as allies and Canadians as partners. So during, and Eliot, you were 100%, 1,000% right on the 1-year wars, because I remember my country program went from 2006 to 2008. And then I wrote another country program, which was 2008 to 2011. And then there was another one from 2011 to 2014. They were 3-year increments. And we knew that this is going to be a long-standing programs. Why are we doing this? It was because we were confined by the government and what they wanted in terms of our treasury. And the second thing, if we were really good allies, one thing that I noticed, because I had all the cross-border programs, I had the Afghan refugee program with UNHCR. I had the polio eradication, which was a cross-border project between Afghanistan and Pakistan. And then we had Canada actually led this process. It was called the Dubai process to really manage the border. So as Canada's allies, were we really effective in playing that honest broker between Afghanistan and Pakistan? I don't think so, because and during that time, all the resources went to Afghanistan. All the diplomatic and the other infrastructure that we needed to, manage the Pakistan side of the border, it wasn't there. And Canada actually had a really robust program and really robust, civil society network. Like Canada was so well regarded, especially after the earthquake in Pakistan. And that all evaporated because we closed down so many parts of the embassy in Islamabad.
Neha?
We have two related questions. The first is by Nasser Yousafzai, who's asking, what is the panelists' opinion on the Taliban 2.0? Have they changed? Will they change? And what are their chances of being recognized internationally? Humayun has a similar query, but a little different. And he's asking, what would a public US Taliban engagement beyond humanitarian help and the Doha Agreement look like?
I would just say,
Want to go ahead?
Yeah, I would just say briefly, if we look at the incentives around Taliban 2.0, I think there's sort of this narrative that has come out in certain circles, a little bit from the administration, that, well, it's been a 20-year-long war. Everyone's been fighting and is very, very tired. And sort of the Taliban have learned the error of their ways, and they're coming out of this war chastened and reformed to become Taliban 2.0. I mean, I think that's just insane. I mean, they've just won the victory of all victories. So the idea that this experience in some way has now reformed them to become Taliban 2.0 I think is really folly. And I think that in addition to that, in the pullout, it is actually in our incentive, or is at least in the administration's incentive, in selling this pullout to the American people, that the Taliban be reformed. If the Taliban are reformed, then us leaving really isn't so bad, because we're handing over the country to a group that's, it's not the bad Taliban, it's the good Taliban. So I'm very, very skeptical that this is any type of reformed Taliban, because they have no reason to reform. They just won. Why would you reform when you just won? Yeah. And it makes a lot of sense for us or for the US government at least, to want to see them reformed, because that in some ways can create top cover for our withdrawal. And I would say,
or call them reformed. Isn't that what you mean? Call them
reformed. Yeah, call them reformed and say, these aren't. So I would say, listen, if we want to look at what's just happened, I think the fact again that this weekend the Taliban said, we are not going to be participating with the United States in any way, shape, or form in fighting the Islamic State. I mean, I think that kind of tells you everything that you need to know. So I wouldn't bet my children's future on the fact that this is a new, better Taliban that is going to distance itself from groups like Al Qaeda. And I think it's very dangerous to try to sell ourselves that narrative.
Rasima, did you have thoughts?
No, I was going to say retweet that, because that's true.
Yeah.
No, I think, and it's Canada, we're such a country of nice, right? Like somebody, a former colleague, he was talking about how the government in Canada is run so well that people sleep at night. And actually, one of my Afghan staff, I had to explain to him, you're here, you literally have to worry about nothing. There's nobody coming to your door. We're so Canadian nice that we just, we don't think of these like the really dark elements, but they're there. And we just don't, sometimes I feel like we just don't address them because of our Canadian niceness. And sometimes it's just, we turn away because we actually don't know what to do.
I saw that a lot, I have to say. There was a naivete, I think, that was evident among Europeans too. There's a whole, this question raises, I think, a whole topic of conversation that we don't have time to go into, but it is about humanitarian aid. And, the G7 is getting ready to shovel a whole lot of humanitarian aid into the country. And it's just odd to me that the hurry with which much of the international community seems to be trying to figure out a face-saving, as Eliot puts it, way of, quote, engaging with, a regime of international terrorists and narcotics traffickers. And interestingly, if you look at the terms of the Doha Agreement, in effect, they recognize the Taliban. And the reason I say that, although every clause of the Doha Agreement says, the Islamic Emirate of Afghanistan, which we do not recognize, and which, for the purposes of this agreement, we call the Taliban. Every single element of the agreement starts with that very wordy introduction. However, one of the Taliban's commitments is not to issue visas or passports to international terrorists. Well, who is able to issue visas and passports? A government, right. Nothing other than a government. So in effect, the United States conferred sovereignty on the Taliban. And with that document, it was easy for them to go around to all the local level commanders and say, look, the Americans are leaving. We have sovereignty. We are coming back. So you should join us. And given that aspect of things, it's actually no surprise that it went as quickly as it did to me. But the humanitarian aid, what I wonder is, why are we not talking about conditions and verification the way the international community would with any other treaty with a hostile government? And you have to call the Taliban a hostile government, right? Yeah. So why are we not even discussing what are the conditions that would be put on international aid and what are the verification provisions?
I just want to say one thing about that. So in Canada, we actually have an act called the UN Act, where we're not allowed to evaluate, we're not allowed to audit any of our funds that go to the UN. So we are like handcuffed.
That is ridiculous. That's stunning.
Yes.
Wow. Neha, do you want to throw us one more? I think we're getting to the end of our time, but I was informed that it would be legal to slop over just a little bit, and then I will claim the moderator's privilege of wrapping up.
Absolutely. We're getting a couple of questions about the regional actors. So one, basically, the fact that the analysis here in the United States is obviously centered around the United States, and what happens if we focus on the dynamics within Afghanistan and the neighboring countries, Pakistan, China, and India, and does that change our view? And similarly, another question is asking about whether the panelists believe that Afghanistan's instability will consume Pakistan and its nuclear arsenal. What are the options? What are the carrots and sticks that are available?
Who wants to take a stab at that one?
Oh, sorry. I didn't mean to do that. Sorry.
Go for it. You have the floor, girl. Go for it.
Well, it's so funny because there's like so many things like that are true at the same time, that Canada's made this commitment to human rights and especially to humanitarian assistance. But sometimes I find that we're not honoring them, and we could do better, and we could be better. We could be better allies. We could be better partners by doing really some like small tweaks on things, but we're not doing them. And we have intelligence that is valuable. Sometimes people don't believe that but it's true, because we just have different networks than other countries. So I think we could be a better partner. That's my bottom line.
Yeah,
Eliot?
I would just offer up my experience in the wars I've covered, even as a journalist, has been, as Americans, we so often make the fatal miscalculation in believing that, first of all, that this is our problem to clean up, and if only we can figure the correct alchemy of policy solutions, suddenly, the clouds will clear and it will be a bright, shining day for whatever country we are intervening in. And that is obviously never the case. The solution obviously always resides through seeing the challenge through the eyes of the people who are dealing with the challenge. So I think that not understanding the war in Afghanistan from the Afghan perspective, and not understanding it from the perspective of regional actors, and I would say the same of an Iraq or a Syria, has been an endemic problem for the United States, and it's one that we just have a very difficult time to not center ourselves in every single situation.
And Eliot, I really like that example. And I swear, I was like, I'm not going to talk about polio, but okay, here it is. So Canada was like the largest investor in the polio eradication project, but it had many partners: USAID, the Japanese, the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. And one thing that like always struck me, so I would go to my weekly national coordination meetings. And I was the only donor there sometimes. And like Canada, like we were very invested. Canada had contributed $120 million to this effort to eradicate this disease from Afghanistan. And so I would go, I would listen. So many times I would just go and sit in the WHO office or sit in the UNICEF office and just listen and just talk to staff, Afghan staff. And they would tell me, they were like, Rasima, we really want to do this, but we don't have, permission. Can we do this? And I'm like, sure, do it. And I'm like, why haven't you done it? And they were like, well, we need permission. We need to do this. And, one thing that I did, because I was meeting with, partners on such a regular basis, and the biggest problem that we faced was that vaccines weren't getting into the most remote places. And I said, oh, you know what? I have a really good contact at the Afghan Red Crescent Society. Why don't I ask them if they can help us out for free and deliver vaccines? So there was a Canadian solution. So sometimes, Eliot, just you were saying that we, always an American solution isn't one, but I think this was like a great one because, we would sit and talk to the Afghans, the Ministry of Health, the other donors in this project to find this solution. And so what happened was, I remember when I came to Afghanistan in early 2010, we had almost 200 cases of polio every month. I was down to 12 by the time that I left in November of 2011 in a war zone, because it was collaboration, cooperation, and sitting down to see how can we really use our resources well. So I think those kinds of conversations have to continue.
Yeah, I think just bouncing off of that of the point that center ourselves in the population that we're supposedly there to work with and benefit. I mean, I think it might be surprising to a lot of people to know that all of my Afghan friends thought that the United States was on the side of the Taliban. And it became impossible by about 2010 or 2011 for me to come up with an argument that could convince them that we were not, given that we were not addressing the role of Pakistan, And frankly, given this outcome, I don't see how they can think otherwise. And just in terms of the broader community, which is what that question was about, let me throw a couple of strategic ideas out there. Number one, the Pakistani government argues that it is in existential threat from India, and that is why it has nukes, and that is why, you know, it has a military dictatorship. And I would just ask, well, then why are they, you know, why is Pakistan sticking its finger into India's eye by sending, you know, terrorists across the border? Because it's very clear that Pakistan lies behind a lot of the terrorist attacks against India. And I would just submit that it may be that it's helpful to have an existential threat if you're a military dictatorship. It's a good pretext to stay in power. And secondly, I would wonder why Afghan officials, knowing how sensitive that is, allowed the Indian government to put consulates all over the country,
26.
including on the Pakistani border. And why, you know, Afghan officials were harboring Baluch separatists in Kandahar. I mean, you start playing these kinds of games and you're inviting what you just got. And so in terms of instability in Afghanistan being a problem for Pakistan, on the contrary, it's exactly what Pakistan wants, is a weak, either an Afghanistan that's under its control or an Afghanistan that is helpless. Certainly not one that offers you know, an enticing example for Pashtuns who live in Pakistan. And lastly, I'd just like to touch on China, which was also raised in that question. It's so interesting that the Biden administration framed this withdrawal in terms of, we're washing our hands of the Middle East, let's turn to China. So Afghanistan borders China. Afghanistan is closer to China's sphere of influence than it really is to the Middle East. I mean, it's both. But, you know, China has the license for the largest copper deposit in the world, which is in Afghanistan. Afghanistan would be a perfect north-south spur on the Belt and Road Initiative. And China, the Chinese government, is a very close ally of the Pakistani government. So in my own personal view, in terms of geostrategy, withdrawing from Afghanistan the way we did was a gift to China. And I don't know if you guys agree, but let me just finish up with this also kind of wide angle reflection. Eliot, you suggest that the corruption of the Afghan government was really about financing a contingency plan for officials. And I get that to some extent, but it's way beyond that. I mean, I just saw an article saying Rahim Wardak's son, you know, bought several multi-million-dollar mansions in California and I think Palm Beach. I can't remember where they all are, right? This was absolutely money-addicted looting. It was a Ponzi scheme in the Afghan National Bank that basically caused 1/10 of the country's GDP to disappear. It was shakedowns at every street corner by every single Afghan official that ordinary people interacted with. And that money didn't stay in those individuals' pockets. It went up the chain to feed the higher ups. But what I've been thinking more and more strongly ever since August 15th is this. I don't think Afghanistan just represents a failure of US foreign and security policy. I see way too many parallels between the way the Afghan government ran and the way the US government runs. Meaning, for example, the bank Ponzi scheme I just mentioned. Well, who built the private banking sector in Afghanistan? The same financial service professionals that who were building a bubble in the American financial services in the American banks, which caused the crash of 2008. So Afghanistan's crash came 2 years later, but it was the same kind of thing. Look at the failed policies that were, promulgated or influenced by defense contractors, development contractors, or financial services industry, real estate professionals, fossil fuel magnates, who are cycling in and out of government, just like the Afghan government contained, one brother in government and the other brother in the private sector getting all of the contracts. These kinds of networks running our government as well as running the Afghan government produced a lot of failed policies. And so I think that, and yet got very, very rich in the process, right, both there and here. And so I would just say, if we don't see Afghanistan as a mirror reflecting our own country's dysfunction, we may be headed toward a similar fate to Afghanistan's. That's a pretty heavy warning to leave us on, but I think it's serious. With that, I think I'll leave us with that warning and with a great deal of thanks to all of you who joined us, because God knows you hear enough words and you read enough words, you Fletcher students and alums, and we all write and talk enough as it is without extra opportunities like this. Thank you very much, Gabriel, for your audiovisual support. Gabriel tells us that this is going to end kind of abruptly when we all sign off, so be aware of that. And thank you, Neha, thank you, Jerry, and thanks to the Fletcher School, as always, for hosting this type of discussion. Good evening.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.